The room didn't feel like anything special at first. Just another industry event. Cameras, conversations, familiar faces, the usual rhythm of Hollywood. But sometimes, life doesn't announce its turning points. It just quietly places two people in the same moment. That night at the Day USA Gala, everything changed for Nicole Kidman. And it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple. An introduction, a glance, a conversation that didn't feel important at the time, but would later reshape her entire life. What followed wasn't a headline moment. It was something quieter, something real, a connection that didn't rely on fame or pressure or timing. Just two people, meeting without expectation. And after everything she had been through, the fame, the loss, the marriage, the collapse, the reinvention, that kind of simplicity felt almost foreign, because Nicole Kidman's life had never been quiet. From childhood, she had been shaped inside intensity. From early performances, she had been trained to feel everything deeply. And from Hollywood, she had learned something even more important, that nothing stays stable forever. Every success comes with pressure. Every relationship comes with scrutiny. Every moment comes with consequence. But what people often miss about her story is not the fame, it's the endurance. Because long before that night, she had already lived through transformation after transformation. She had learned how to survive emotional collapse in public, how to rebuild identity under global attention, how to keep working when life outside the camera was breaking apart. And yet, she never stopped moving forward, not even when the world slowed her down, not even when expectations became heavier than roles, not even when personal life became something she had to protect from public consumption. That is what makes a journey different. Not perfection, but persistence. And the truth is, most people only see the surface, the awards, the red carpets, the performances, but not the cost behind them, not the emotional weight carried between roles, not the private rebuilding that happens when the cameras are off. Because acting, for her, was never just performance. It was emotional survival, a controlled release of everything life kept asking her to hold inside. That is why her characters feel real, because they often come from somewhere real. Loss, fear, strength, isolation, reinvention. Every role becomes a reflection of something she has already lived through, and that is why audiences connect, even when they don't realize why. But what makes her story even more unusual is that even after decades in the industry, she never settled into comfort. She kept choosing difficult roles, difficult emotions, difficult transformations, not because she had to, but because she couldn't exist in anything less. And that is where her legacy becomes clear. It's not just longevity, it's evolution, a constant refusal to become static. Because in Hollywood, staying the same is often the fastest way to disappear. And she did the opposite. She changed again and again, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was misunderstood, even when it cost her stability. And maybe that is why her story continues to resonate so deeply. Because underneath everything, the fame, the relationships, the headlines, there is something very human. A person constantly rebuilding themselves in public, while trying to remain whole in private. And when you strip everything else away, that is what remains. Not the myth, not the image, but the endurance of someone who refuses to stop becoming. And maybe that is the real reason her story still holds attention today. Because it isn't finished. It never really feels finished. Even now, even after everything, there is always another chapter waiting. Another transformation, another reinvention. And that is why when she finally speaks, when she finally says something that stops a room, people listen, because they understand. It is never just words. It is everything that came before them, and everything still being carried forward. What makes a moment powerful isn't always what's said. It's what it carries. And when Nicole Kidman spoke at 58, people didn't just hear her words. They felt everything behind them. Because by that point, her life wasn't just a timeline. It was layers. Layers of identity, of transformation, of survival, and of quiet battles that never made headlines. From the outside, it always looked like control, grace, elegance, precision. But inside that control, there had always been intensity. Because acting, for her, was never just a profession. It was immersion, complete, unfiltered, sometimes even dangerous. There were roles where she didn't just perform emotion. She lived inside it, stayed inside it, carried it long after the camera stopped. And over time, that kind of commitment leaves a mark, not visible, but real. Because when you train yourself to feel everything deeply, you don't get to turn that off when the scene ends. It follows you into quiet moments, into relationships, into life outside the frame. And that's where the real cost begins. Because the world sees performance, but never the recovery, never the emotional reset, never the exhaustion of constantly becoming someone else. And yet, she kept doing it, again and again, because that's where she felt most alive. But life outside acting wasn't any easier. If anything, it was more complicated, because fame doesn't protect you from loss. It amplifies it. Every relationship becomes public. Every mistake becomes a headline. Every personal moment becomes something people feel entitled to analyze. And when her marriage ended, it wasn't just personal. It was global. Her identity had been tied, for years, to Tom Cruise. And when that ended, it created something deeper than heartbreak. It created absence, a sudden space where something constant used to exist. And rebuilding from that kind of absence is not simple, because you're not just rebuilding a relationship. You're rebuilding yourself. And she did it in the only way she knew how. By working. By stepping into roles that demanded everything she had left. By turning personal pain into performance. Not for attention, but for survival. Because when everything else feels unstable, work becomes structure. And structure becomes stability. But even that has limits. Because no amount of success replaces what's missing privately. And one of the most difficult parts of her story is something she rarely speaks about directly. Her children, a connection that became distant, complicated, difficult to define publicly. And that kind of distance doesn't fade. It stays quiet, heavy, unresolved, no matter how successful you become. Because some parts of life cannot be controlled, no matter who you are. And that is where her story becomes something deeper than celebrity. It becomes human. Because underneath everything, the fame, the awards, the performances, there is still someone navigating loss, trying to hold on to connections, trying to rebuild something that doesn't have a clear path back. And still, she moved forward, not perfectly, not easily, but consistently. And that consistency is what shaped everything that came after. When she met Keith Urban, it didn't feel like another chapter. It felt like a shift. Because for the first time in a long time, there was stability, not built on image, not built on industry, but built on understanding. And even that came with challenges, because real relationships require something Hollywood rarely allows: vulnerability without performance. And that takes time. But over the years, that foundation held, quietly, without spectacle, without constant headlines, just consistency. And that consistency gave her something she had been missing for a long time: ground, something real, something outside the camera, something that didn't require transformation to exist. And maybe that's why, when she spoke later in life, it carried more weight, because it wasn't coming from ambition anymore. It was coming from experience, from everything she had lived through, everything she had lost, everything she had rebuilt, and everything she still carried. Because at 58, you're not speaking from theory. You're speaking from memory, from scars, from truth that has already been tested. And that's why the room changed. Not because of what she said, but because of who was saying it. Someone who had already lived through more than most people ever will. Someone who had nothing left to prove, and nothing left to protect in the same way. And when someone like that speaks honestly, it lands differently, because it's not performance. It's reflection. And reflection always hits deeper, because it forces people to look at their own lives differently, to question what matters, to question what lasts, to question what success actually means. And maybe that's the real reason her story continues to hold attention. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's layered, because it reflects something people recognize, even if they don't say it out loud. The idea that life doesn't move in straight lines, that success doesn't remove struggle, that reinvention is not optional. It's necessary, and that sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who never break, but the ones who rebuild quietly, again and again, without needing the world to understand how hard it actually was. And that is a story most people never see, because it doesn't happen on screen. It happens in between, in silence, in private, in moments that never become headlines, but define everything that comes after. And that is what makes a story powerful. Not the fame, not the roles, not the recognition, but the endurance behind all of it. And maybe that's the real bombshell. Not something she revealed in a sentence, but something her life revealed over time. That behind every image, there's a reality far more complex than people ever see. There's a moment in every long career where success stops feeling like a destination and starts feeling like something you have to carry. For Nicole Kidman, that moment didn't come early. It came after decades, after the awards, after the reinventions, after the world had already decided who she was supposed to be. Because when you stay in the spotlight long enough, people don't just watch you. They define you. They create a version of you that fits their expectations. And slowly, that version becomes louder than reality. But reality doesn't disappear. It just waits. And eventually, it demands to be seen. That's what made this phase of her life different. Because she wasn't chasing anything anymore. Not validation, not approval, not even legacy. She had already achieved all of it. What remained was something more difficult. Honesty. And honesty, especially in public life, is complicated because it requires letting go of control, letting go of image, letting go of the version of yourself that people are comfortable with, and stepping into something more real, more exposed, more human. By the time she reached this stage, she had lived through more transformation than most careers ever survive. She had gone from rising talent to global star to public figure defined by relationships to independent force rebuilding her identity. And each version required something different, a different mindset, a different level of resilience, a different kind of strength. But what people rarely consider is what happens between those versions, the quiet transitions, the uncertainty, the moments where there is no clear direction. Because reinvention sounds powerful, but living through it is uncertain. You don't always know what comes next. You don't always know who you're becoming. You only know that you can't stay the same. And that space, between who you were and who you are becoming, is where most people struggle. But that's where she lived, over and over again. And each time, she adapted, not by resisting change, but by leaning into it, choosing roles that challenged her, stories that demanded vulnerability, characters that required her to go deeper than comfort, because staying comfortable was never part of her process. And that's what kept her relevant. Not trends, not popularity, but evolution. While others tried to maintain an image, she allowed hers to shift, to grow, to change, even when it meant risking everything she had built. Because the truth is, relevance isn't about staying visible. It's about staying real. And reality is always changing. But even with that understanding, life doesn't become easier. Because personal challenges don't disappear with professional success. They continue, quietly, sometimes invisibly, and often without resolution. There are parts of her life that remain complex, relationships that are not easily explained, connections that exist in a space between presence and distance. And those things don't fade with time. They become part of you, part of how you see the world, part of how you move forward. And yet, she never stopped moving forward, even when it would have been easier to step back, even when the pressure of expectation could have justified slowing down, even when the industry itself began to shift. Because Hollywood changes, constantly, new faces, new trends, new definitions of success. And staying relevant inside that environment for decades requires more than talent. It requires adaptability, awareness, and the willingness to evolve without losing yourself. That balance is rare, and it's fragile, because evolving too much can disconnect you from your identity. But not evolving at all guarantees irrelevance. And somehow, she managed both. She evolved while staying recognizable. She changed without disappearing. And that is why her presence still matters. Because it represents something that goes beyond performance. It represents endurance. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need attention. The kind that continues, even when no one is watching closely. And that's why moments like this, moments where she speaks openly, carry so much weight. Because they don't come from ambition. They come from experience. From everything that has already been tested. Everything that has already been lost. Everything that has already been rebuilt. And when you listen closely, you realize something important. The bombshell people expected was never just about a single statement. It wasn't one shocking revelation. It wasn't one moment. It was something much deeper. It was the realization that her entire life had been leading to this level of clarity, this level of understanding, this level of acceptance. Because after everything, the highs, the losses, the pressure, the reinventions, what remains is perspective. And perspective changes everything. It changes how you define success. It changes how you see relationships. It changes what you hold on to and what you finally let go. And maybe that's what people felt in that moment. Not surprise, not shock, but recognition. Recognition of truth. The kind of truth that doesn't need to be dramatic, to be powerful. The kind that settles in slowly, but stays with you because it reflects something universal. That no matter how successful a life looks from the outside, there's always something deeper happening underneath. Always something unresolved. Always something evolving. And that's not weakness. That's reality. And maybe that's the real story here. Not a headline. Not a single moment. But a lifetime of transformation. Finally reaching a point where it no longer needs to prove anything. Only to exist honestly. And that kind of honesty is rare. Especially in a world built on image, which is why it matters and why it stays long after the moment passes.